So this is lecture 1 of our blood unit. The scientific name for the study of blood is hematology. Hemato refers to blood. And then ology is the study of, as I'm sure you know. So hematology is the study of blood. We are going to move from this unit, hematology, into the lymphatic and immune system. And you'll see that they are quite connected in a lot of ways as well, because parts of the blood do immune system tasks. So blood has 3 major functions. We'll kind of talk about each of them in turn. Its most obvious function is probably transport, transporting oxygen and nutrients throughout the body. But blood also serves to help regulate a variety of systems. If you think back to the endocrine system, those hormones were transported, of course, in the bloodstream. And then, kind of as I mentioned, there is a protective role as well in terms of immune system function and also like clotting and things of that nature. So what does blood transport? Nutrients. So when we talk about diabetes, for instance, we're talking about blood sugar, because sugar absorbed from food travels through the blood to the cells that need it. Other things as well, like amino acids, lipids, all of that stuff is traveling through the blood. It's kind of the transport system of the body. Respiratory gases. So if you think about oxygen or carbon dioxide going to and from the lungs, they travel in red blood cells on hemoglobin. So they are moving that way as well. Hormones, as we've talked about, get from their glands, where they're produced to target organs, again through blood. And then waste products. Urea gets filtered out through the kidneys because of blood flow. Carbon dioxide I mentioned. Any metabolic wastes that need to be gotten rid of, especially by the kidneys, will go that through the blood. Blood flow to the liver also helps like detoxify poisons and things, so all of that is going to travel through the bloodstream. Regulation, again, is something we've talked about a little bit already this year, but not maybe in the context of blood. So one of the things that blood can do is help to maintain body temperature by transferring heat. If more blood flows to the surface up by the skin, then that's going to allow heat to transfer out into the environment. If it's cold, then the blood volume will stay more interior and keep your heat inside. Another way that blood functions as a regulator is by helping to maintain pH in body tissues. So it's just a little bit basic pH, but there is a buffer system, a carbonic acid buffer system, that helps to keep the pH within that range. We'll talk a little bit more about the buffer in just a second. Here we go. So if you remember from chemistry, acids are items that release hydrogen ions. Bases accept hydrogen ions. So carbon dioxide, which comes from cells as metabolic waste, can react with water to form this acid, carbonic acid. It is a weak acid, and it can dissociate into this right here, bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. And so this reaction, as it kind of goes in both directions, because these can combine to make this, which can split to make that, those reactions, forward and backward, help to make sure that there's an appropriate amount of hydrogen ions, but not too many, and keep the blood at the proper, slightly basic pH that it needs to be in order for our bodies to work correctly. Blood also functions in protection, as I said. So one of the mechanisms is more mechanical, and that is through clotting. So blood itself helps to prevent blood loss by initiating clot formation. So when there's a break in the blood vessel wall, there's a whole clotting cascade that occurs. These plasma proteins come in, they make fibers, fibrin fibers. The platelets stick, and you get a mechanical barrier to the blood continuing to exit the vessel, right? So those factors all are present in blood itself. They're just dissolved until such time as they are needed to form a clot. So here are just a couple of products you might have seen that kind of help that clotting, those clotting factors get to work quickly. So a clotting spray, and then a sponge. So if a person was bleeding significantly and needed some fast clotting action, these would help. This is kind of a cool invention. It's called Chitoclot. And so normally one of the ways that you treat a wound is by putting pressure on it, and that helps everything to stay at the site and form the clot. So blood loss is diminished. But some injuries are non-compressible. You can't just put pressure on them because maybe they're too big or because of their location. And so there is this foam called Chitoclot, which is kind of like shaving cream, and that you can spray into a wound, and it will expand to fill the space that you can't compress. And it helps to quickly stop the bleeding to prevent blood loss during transport. It's especially good, for military personnel or like paramedics who might, need to stop bleeding really quickly to get a person where they can get surgical treatment or what have you. Okay, so that's sort of mechanical barriers. The other piece of the protection task, is that the blood contains within it white blood cells that are constantly monitoring the body for invading pathogens. So these white blood cells synthesize antibodies. Antibodies act as markers to help other white blood cells recognize that something needs to be taken care of in the body. There are complement proteins which encourage white blood cells to go to a particular location and then to destroy invaders or infected cells. And we'll talk much more, like I said, about this particular task of blood when we transition, not next week, but the following week, to the lymphatic system and immune system. So more on this to come later. Here is a really fuzzy picture of a yeast here, and then this is a white blood cell. I hope it's better if you look at the PDF, because that's really fuzzy. Okay, so what is blood? It is a fluid. We tend to have around 5 liters, a little over for males, a little less for females, but kind of right around 5 liters. It is a fairly viscous liquid. Water is a 1, and blood is a 4 to a 5. So it's kind of thick and viscous. The pH, as I mentioned, is just a little bit basic, and that's where the proteins and enzymes that we have work the best. And then the salinity of blood is 0.85%. So there is some salts dissolved in the blood, and those, remember, are important for muscle contraction, nerve transmission, all of that stuff. As I said, it's the only fluid tissue. I guess I just said it was a fluid, but it's the only fluid tissue. It is a connective tissue because it has cells within the fluid matrix. And I think you can probably see why it's a connective tissue, because it connects to everything. It is made up of plasma, which is the majority, slightly over the majority of blood. That's the fluid portion. If you were to spin it down in a centrifuge, you'd have the plasma, and then this buffy coat, which is white blood cells and platelets, which is just a small fraction, less than 1% of whole blood. And then erythrocytes are about 45%. So obviously, these are a little bit estimate, because some of that 100% is made up of the buffy coat, but mainly red blood cells, plasma, a little bit of white blood cells. The hematocrit is the other word for percentage of red blood cells, erythrocytes. Males, it tends to be a little bit higher, 47%, plus or minus 5%. Females, a little bit lower, 42%, but again, plus or minus 5%. So it really depends on size and activity and where you live and all kinds of things. Blood plasma contains mostly water, 90%, some protein, albumins, globulins, fibrinogen, which is a clotting protein. It contains nutrients, so the transport aspect, glucose, carbohydrates, amino acid, those building blocks that are getting delivered so they could be used. Electrolytes, so the salts that we talked about. Non-protein nitrogenous substances, so that could be waste from amino acid breakdown, for instance, or nitrogen gas. And then respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Mostly they're carried in the red blood cells, but there can be some dissolved oxygen or dissolved carbon dioxide as well. And then the formed elements. So everything that's not plasma is considered a formed element. Erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and platelets, which are platelets. They're just tiny little bits of stuff. They're all considered formed elements because they're formed mainly in the bone marrow. In this picture, you can see the little donut shape of red blood cells. They're a biconcave disc, as you'll see. And then you can see white blood cells as well, and then some platelets, or the little specks. So means red. So erythrocytes are red blood cells. And they have, as you see, this biconcave shape. So they're kind of like, they're like a donut, but there's not a hole in the middle. It's just thin in the middle. This shape helps to increase surface area to allow diffusion across the membrane easily and quickly. The plasma membrane is flexible because they need to be able to travel through capillaries and things. And manufacture of red blood cells is stimulated by a hormone, erythropoietin, from the kidneys. So the kidneys kind of monitor the blood and then release erythropoietin when red blood cells need to be replenished. So there is a nice picture, again, of the biconcave discs, and you can see that they're not like holy, they're just sort of thin in the middle. Erythrocytes are a good example of structure and function. They don't have a nucleus, they don't have any other organelles because they don't need them, they don't ever reproduce themselves. But what they do need is to have a lot of hemoglobin to transport oxygen. So that allows room for hemoglobin. It also prevents oxygen from being consumed as it's being transported. You can imagine if there were mitochondria, for instance, in the red blood cells, they would just, burn through the oxygen, creating ATP, and not deliver it appropriately to where it needed to go. So red blood cells are filled with hemoglobin. All that extra is the hemoglobin. It's about 97% of the cell contents, like membrane, a little bit of cytoplasm, a lot of hemoglobin. The job of hemoglobin is to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. See, when it's oxygenated, it's called oxyhemoglobin. Red blood cells are the most numerous of the formed elements, as we saw. Females have about 5 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood, and then males have a little over that, about 5.5 million per cubic millimeter of blood. And here is the structure of hemoglobin. We're going to talk more about this next week when we talk about malaria and sickle cell anemia. But you can see there's 4 protein chains, 2 alpha and 2 beta, and they associate together to make this like cloverleaf shape. And in the middle of each one is a heme group with an iron, and that iron is really good at carrying oxygen, and slightly less good at carrying carbon dioxide. And there's some really cool conformational things, like shape change things that happen as oxygen binds and as it's released to help ensure that oxygen transport happens as effectively as it can in the body. Where would the white blood cells be? They would be in the buffy coat. So remember, the buffy coat is the white blood cells and the platelets. Red blood cells, like all cells, most cells, don't live an infinite amount of time. This is their life cycle. So when the kidneys sense low oxygen levels because of low red blood cells, they produce erythropoietin that increases levels in the blood. So they send raw materials and things to make more red blood cells in the red bone marrow. Iron is necessary for this. New erythrocytes then enter the bloodstream once they're produced, and they function for about 120 days, so about 4 months. When they are damaged, they get broken down in the liver and the spleen and in the bone marrow, kind of recycled. The hemoglobin is broken down into iron, which can then be used again for making new red blood cells. And then bilirubin in the liver, which we'll talk about later when we talk about babies, and jaundice. And then those raw materials can be used again. Here is the EPO mechanism. You can see when oxygen is low, we make more red blood cells. When oxygen's high, then that doesn't happen. So the lifespan, again, of erythrocytes is about 4 months, around 100 to 120 days. In that time, through the body, they travel 750 miles, which is about from Eugene to Los Angeles. So they travel through the body many, 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 many times, as you can imagine, carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then when they are worn out at the end of their life cycle, they're broken down into their parts for reuse, especially the iron and all of the protein parts. Okay, last question. What would you expect after traveling to high altitude for 2 weeks? Okay. So initially, oxygen levels would be depressed because there's less oxygen at high altitude. That is going to lead to an elevated amount of EPO. Just going to tell the liver to release some iron, and ultimately, after 2 weeks, there will be an increase in the number of red blood cells in the blood. So all of these would happen, but in that period of time, you would have kind of acclimated, and so there would already be that increase of red blood cells in the blood. So that's the end of part 1. On to part 2 next time.